Go ahead and my name is Dominique McCoy, and on behalf of our team at the To&Through project, our co-authors at the UChicago Consortium on School Research, and our colleagues at the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy and Practice, I'd like to thank everybody for joining today's webinar on the release of our research brief, the 4-year fallacy, 4-year versus 6-year bachelor degree completion rates. So today we are going to be talking about the topic of time to degree completion for CPS students. And I think before we jump in, I think it's important to preface all of our conversation today by acknowledging that supporting CPS students in their pursuit of finishing their degrees, period, on any timeline is our #1 priority in this work, right? And that being said, we are really hopeful that today's look into the patterns around CPS students' time to degree completion and their lived experiences of the many unique timelines that CPS students are currently navigating will help provide us as a system with an important window into how we can continue to better understand, interrogate, and strengthen successful and more equitable college pathways that exist for young people in our city. So we can go to the next slide. We can take a look at our agenda. We are really excited about all the work we got an opportunity to share. And we have a really packed agenda, so let's just do a quick look at how we're going to be spending our time together. First, as many of you have probably seen from our event description, aside from the research brief, today the To&Through project is also releasing a new set of our qualitative student stories and some other accompanying resources that I'm going to take a moment to just touch on before we jump in. From there, we're going to get an opportunity to hear. From our some members of representing our research team, Jenny Nagaoka and Shelby Mahaffey. We're going to provide an overview of some of the research. And finally, we're going to be spending the bulk of our time on the part that I'm personally most excited about, because I get a chance to be in conversation with these phenomenal people who you will meet later in our program. That are going to help us make some meaning of some of this data and some of this research from their perspective and their expert opinions to help us close out with a panel discussion. A couple logistics notes before we move on. Just as a reminder, for those of you who have RSVP'd, you should have received an invite for our post-event discussion. This is an optional space that we've been pulling together for the majority of our virtual events in response to a lot of the feedback that we received from you all. Just to provide a space for you to be in conversation with our research team, with your fellow attendees, just to engage around some of the data that we're seeing today, give us an opportunity to share how we're interpreting some of the findings, and to host some small group discussion around our collective opportunities to respond. Last, I'd also want to point your attention to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to share your questions throughout the presentation. We have team members who are ready to answer questions in real time. So please feel free to keep those coming in. We'll do our best to get to as many of those as we can. And then finally, all attendees will be receiving a copy of the recording of this presentation. So we can go to the next slide just to touch on a couple of our accompanying resources. So I think for those of you that know us, we believe at To&Through, we believe that data is a really important starting place and a powerful resource that can inform intentionality, collaboration, strategic work around supporting students and building more equitable education pathways. And in our work, we try to be really intentional about understanding that not all data can answer all questions. And so when it comes to our quantitative work, you'll often hear us talk about how we believe that it's a really powerful resource that can help us better understand kind of that who, what, where, and when of student experiences, but also that rarely, it's pretty rare that our quantitative data can provide some perspective on some of the why behind the data. That's always really important. And this is part of why we launched our Student Stories project, which is led by our amazing team member, Jessica Vargas, who interviews real CPS alumni on their post-secondary journeys with a goal of helping us all capture these stories to help us embrace some of the complexities that are facing current CPS students, gives us a chance to honor both the triumphs that are happening every single day and also some of the challenges that they are facing as well. And then most importantly, giving us a chance to elevate some voice and perspective from CPS alums to just give us an opportunity to continue to hear their suggestions and how we can improve post-secondary systems for CPS students that are going to be coming behind them. As part of the series being released today, Jessica interviewed and documented the stories of 6 CPS alumni reflecting on their own pathways and timelines to college graduation. While these are not necessarily meant to be representative of all students in CPS, we are really excited about these qualitative data resources providing real insights and perspectives that we think can help readers enhance their understanding of how some of these patterns in the brief are affecting CPS students today, and to share these truly expert opinions on what supports they have found helpful or missing along their own journeys. Finally, one other resource that I would like to point out that's available today is an adaptive lesson plan created by our very own Alexandra Ritson, our Senior Manager of Learning and Engagement, that aims to help students themselves, which are thinking most likely for high school students, gives them an opportunity to try to make meaning of some of the potential disconnect that might exist between their expectations of time to college graduation and actual time to graduation, make connections for what that might mean for their own intended college timelines, and explore some strategies that may help them graduate on timelines of their choosing. So we're really excited. Links for those resources are in the chat for you to take a look at. And with that, it is my pleasure to pass it over to our co-authors, some co-authors for this year's brief, Jenny Nagaoka and Shelby Mahad.
Thank you so much, Dom. And thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. I'm really excited to be sharing these findings and to be hearing more from our panel about their implications. But before we begin to talk about the data, I wanted to provide a little bit of context for this study. So next slide, please. So the quote on your screen is from the To&Through project Equity Stance and describes why we do this work. It highlights how we see our role in the larger college access and completion landscape in our city. The data we share makes public and transparent how well the collective efforts inside and outside of schools are doing to support students to and through high school and college. And an important part of this is making sure we do not shy away from sharing the patterns of disparities and raise critical questions so CPS, higher education, everybody who works with young people can be more focused in their efforts to ensure more students are able to reach their educational aspirations. I do want to emphasize that the descriptive numbers Shelby will be sharing with you paint an important story. But as Dom mentioned, they do not provide answers about why we see these patterns. The numbers are reflective of a much larger local and national context of intentional and unintentional economic and educational disinvestment in communities and schools of color, and systems that are not designed to help students of color be successful. An important part of our equity stance is to hold ourselves and the people who use the data with the data we share responsible for working toward change, and to not ascribe the outcomes we describe to the choices and capacities of students, families, and communities, particularly people of color. We encourage you to use the descriptive data we share with you today in conversation with the student stories we are releasing, as well as other research, your own experiences in the field, and especially to engage in discussions with young people. Okay, next slide, please. So how did we get here? A few years ago, To&Through and the Consortium released a report looking at students' pathways through college. One of the key takeaways from the research was that the pathways many students take to completing a bachelor's degree are far from straightforward. Many students transfer to community colleges or take time off, and many students who do complete a bachelor's degree take longer than 4 years. With this understanding of students' experiences, we wanted to take a closer look at how the diverse pathways can be captured through data on college graduation rates. And in many ways, what we're sharing with you is not surprising, given what we know about the complexities of students' pathways. But this brief does provide us an opportunity to shed some light on some key issues. First off, the graduation rates provide us 2 different ways to quantify students' experience in college, and we seek to reinforce the use of both 4-year and 6-year rates as students plan for college. Second, we want to make sure that students understand that four-year colleges is in many ways a misnomer, and that many students take longer than 4 years to complete. And perhaps most importantly, to destigmatize the common experience of taking longer than 4 years to complete a bachelor's degree. And finally, we want to take this as an opportunity to encourage more collaboration across and within high schools and colleges, and make sure that everyone working around students around college make sure that the challenges that many low-income first-generation college students face in staying enrolled don't turn into barriers to continuing their education. And next, a little bit of national context around the study. Um, there was a national survey that found that 9 out of 10 students starting at a four-year college expected to complete in 4 years. And I'm sure this kind of seemed like a trick question. How long does it take to graduate from a four-year college? But yet, as we will see, many students are taking longer than 4 years to complete. Secondly, and this is sort of I don't know, a little bit of a anecdote around this, but the history about why we use 6-year rates is actually pretty surprising. Higher education institutions are required to submit a lot of information to the U.S. Department of Education's National Center for Education Statistics, including their graduation rates. The original reason for collecting data from colleges was to monitor college athletics, and athletes are eligible to complete for 4 years within a 5-year time span. And so when this measure was developed, it was then extended to 6 years to kind of extend this 5-year window. So this measure that we use to determine college graduation rate isn't based on a set of expectations for most college students or any kind of research evidence, but this rather arbitrary length of time that was originally based on athletic eligibility. Um, on a more serious note, taking longer than 4 years can have real consequences for students. Adding more time in college may mean they need to finance additional tuition and other related expenses. They're delaying the start of their careers. And finally, there may be a psychological cost to not graduating with the class that they had started college with. And so in this brief, we examined three big research questions. The first off is just the very basic question: is how many college enrollees from CPS completed a bachelor's degree in 4 years versus 6 years, and how does this look over time? Secondly, we take a closer look at the students who completed their bachelor's degree in more than 4 years, and seeing how many terms that they were enrolled. So did they take the 8 semesters that would normally constitute 4 years and were taking breaks, or were they enrolled for 9 or 10 or more semesters before completing? And then finally, we wanted to understand how these patterns of 6-year and 4-year 4-year and 6-year completion rates looked by different groups. So how does this look similar across colleges? Does this look similar across high schools? And does this look similar across student characteristics? And with that, I will turn it over to Shelby.
Thanks so much, Jenny. So the first figure that we're looking at here shows the 4 and 6-year completion rates over time among the CPS graduates who immediately enrolled in a bachelor's degree granting institution, a 4-year college, after they graduated from high school. So in this figure, the purple line shows the 6-year completion rate that we're probably most familiar with looking at. And then the orange line underneath shows the 4-year completion rate for the same cohorts of students. So on the far right here, we can see that for the most recent cohort for which we have 6 years of completion data, which is the students from the CPS graduating class of 2014 who immediately enrolled in college, 51% of those students completed a bachelor's degree within 6 years, but only 30% of that same group of students had completed their credential within 4 years, meaning that 21% of all of the enrollees from that cohort completed their credential between 4 and 6 years after their high school graduation date. And there's a few other things I want to note about that figure before we move on. So the first is that this phenomenon is not limited to just CPS graduates. It's not limited to just Illinois students. The closest comparison points that we have in the national completion numbers are that the 6-year completion rate nationally is around 64%, and the 4-year completion rate is around 47%. So across all students nationally, there does exist this gap, but it is bigger for CPS graduates. Another thing here is that the 4-year completion rate, that orange line, has been increasing over time, even as the 6-year completion rate has been relatively flat. So this gap is closing slightly. And then even though that 6-year completion rate does look flat in this figure, it is important to keep in mind here that the number of CPS graduates and the number of CPS graduates enrolling in college have both been increasing over time. And you can see that in the ends at the bottom of this figure. And that's important to keep in mind because even flat college completion rates reflect increasing numbers of CPS graduates who are earning college degrees over time, but it also reflects increasing numbers of CPS graduates who enroll in college and then are not completing a degree over time. And then finally, sorry, one last thing on this slide here. This box around the last 3 rates here is just showing the cohorts that will form the denominator for the rest of the figures that we'll show. So those are the 2012, 2013, and 2014 CPS graduating classes. Okay, thank you. So one of the first questions that we had about this phenomenon that Jenny highlighted was whether this was reflecting students stopping out of college and then returning. So maybe students actually only completing 8 semesters of college enrollment, the 8 semesters they may have originally expected to complete, but over the course of 5 or 6 years, or whether this was actually reflecting students needing to take more than 8 semesters of enrollment to complete their degrees. And this matters because those additional semesters of enrollment have costs for students and their families, literal cost of tuition, and also just students enrolling for more time in college. And so what we're looking at in this figure is just among the students who did complete a bachelor's degree, ultimately, for how many total fall spring semesters of college were those students enrolled. And so what we see here is that although only a relatively small proportion of students were enrolled for the full 12 semesters or 11 semesters, that's that 12% at the top, 67% were enrolled for either 9 or 10 semesters. So a total of 79% of the students who did earn a bachelor's degree were enrolled for more than 8 total fall spring semesters. Only 19% of the students who completed a bachelor's degree had completed their degree in 8 or fewer semesters. So next, we looked at this phenomenon across the different institutions that serve CPS graduates. And each dot here represents one college with their 4-year completion rate on the x-axis and their 6-year completion rate on the y-axis. So if one institution's 4-year and 6-year completion rate were identical, meaning that all of the students who completed a degree completed it within 4 years, they would be on that maroon diagonal there, similar to where institution A is. And then the more students who completed a credential after the 4-year mark, the higher the dot would be above the maroon line. And there's one dot on this figure for every institution that served at least 100 CPS graduates across the 3 cohorts that we looked at. So our main takeaway here in this figure is that there are students at nearly every institution commonly attended by CPS graduates who are completing their degrees after the 4-year mark. This is not limited as a phenomenon to a small number of institutions. It's not limited to just some of the institutions. This is true no matter where CPS graduates are going to college. But there are a couple of specific examples here that we wanted to pull out that we think illustrate why having access to both the 4- and 6-year completion rates is so important. So the first pair, if we look at institutions C and D, these 2 institutions have very similar 6-year completion rates, which means that for the numbers that most of us have access to that are most commonly used, these institutions would look identical in terms of their completion among CPS graduates. However, when we look at their 4-year completion rates, we see that only around 45% of the students at institution C completed their bachelor's degree within 4 years, while around 70% of the students at institution D completed their bachelor's degree within 4 years. So even though these institutions have similar 6-year completion rates, the 4-year completion rates show us that that rate itself is not showing us the full picture of what institutional completion looks like for CPS graduates at those institutions. On the other hand, institutions A and B are an example of institutions that have really similar 4-year completion rates that are relatively low, around 26%. But at institution B, there's a large number of students who then go on to complete a bachelor's degree after that 4-year mark. Well, whereas at institution A, all of the students who were going to complete a bachelor's degree had already completed it by 4 years. So in the end, many more students graduated from institution B than from institution A, even though they had the same 4-year completion rate. So this is just an example of how neither the 4-year or 6-year completion rate on its own gives a complete picture of completion for CPS students at these institutions. So next, we're looking at a very similar figure, but this time the view is across high schools. So again, each dot represents one school, here one high school. Again, a high school from which every student who ultimately completed a bachelor's degree completed that degree within 4 years would be on the maroon line. So the more students that are completing their degree after the 4-year mark, the higher the dot is above the maroon line. And again, our big takeaway here is that this is true for students from essentially all high schools in the district, that there are a large number of students who are completing their degree after the 4-year mark, and that this is true even for selective enrollment students, even for students from high schools with very high college completion rates. For example, some of these green dots towards the right of this figure, these are high schools that have very high completion rates, but still from these high schools, almost 20% of the students are completing their degree, but completing their degree after the 4-year mark. So next, we're going to take a look at these 4-year and 6-year completion rates across different demographic groups of CPS students. So in this next set of figures, the way to read them is that the purple dot represents the 6-year completion rate for that group of students. That's the rate that we're most familiar with seeing reported. And then the orange dot represents the 4-year completion rate. So the black bar shows the gap between the 4-year rate and the 6-year rate. And I want to pause for a minute before we talk through these numbers in more detail, just to remind ourselves of who the students are who make up the denominators here, because these are just the students who graduated from high school and who immediately enrolled in a 4-year college right out of college. So these are all students who likely made personal sacrifices, whose families may have made significant sacrifices for them to enroll in college. And as we've seen, we know that the vast majority of these students make that decision to enroll in college expecting that they will complete their credential in 4 years. And I think that that's important context for this figure, because we see that for young Black men from CPS, although the 6-year completion rate that we're more used to looking at is 31%, the 4-year completion rate is 13%, meaning that only 13% of the young Black men who immediately enrolled in a 4-year college actually earned their bachelor's degree within 4 years. And for Latino young men, the number is 21%. I think another point that's important to highlight here, and maybe another way of looking at these numbers, is that among all of the Black and Latino students who completed degrees, a majority of the completers completed their credential after the 4-year mark, meaning that that is actually currently the most common pathway to a degree for Black and Latino students from CPS. It's actually less common. It's actually rarer for students to complete their degree within 4 years than to complete it between 4 and 6 years. And then finally, we're going to look at these same numbers for CPS students, but across groups of students with different high school GPAs and ACT scores. So what we see here in this figure, which is showing the same numbers, but by high school GPA, is that this phenomenon holds for students of all levels of academic performance in high school, and actually that the difference is highest, both in terms of percentage and in terms of number of students, for students with GPAs in the middle categories between 2.5 and 2.9 and 3.0 and 3.4. So there's no GPA threshold that ensures that students will be able to complete in 4 years. One quick note on this figure is that the not available category here is mostly made up of charter students because we don't receive GPA data from charter schools. And then similarly, when we look at this by ACT score, and this is ACT rather than SAT because students were still taking the ACT in Chicago at this time for these cohorts 2012 through 2014, we see that many students in all college access categories with all ACT scores are completing their degrees after the 4-year mark, just like students with different GPAs. So before we move on to the panel, I do want to just summarize a few of our takeaways here on the next slide. The first is that both the 4-year and 6-year rates are important and are important context for students and important context for all of us who work in this space. The 6-year rates that are most commonly accessible and most commonly reported don't tell the whole story of what's happening for CPS graduates in college, and having access to both rates can give a fuller picture of what completion actually looks like across student groups and across institutions. The second is that completion after 4 years is extremely common currently for CPS students, and that it's a reality that students need to be prepared for. This is currently the main pathway taken to a bachelor's degree for Black and Latino CPS graduates, and students need to be prepared with the skills they need to advocate for themselves and to stay on track to completing their credential. But I think most importantly, there are implications here for the colleges that serve CPS graduates. Colleges need to continue to examine and improve the policies and practices that impact students' ability to complete their degree and to complete their degree on time. And colleges specifically need to continue to improve supports for Black young men and for students of color generally as they interrogate their current practices. But finally, there are many colleges that are already beginning to implement effective evidence-based practice in this domain, and there are lots of opportunities here for institutions to learn from one another about how they can support the CPS graduates in their programs. And with that, I will turn it back over to Dom to transition us into talking about qualitative data and into our panel.
Great. Thank you, Shelby. Thank you, Jenny. So yeah, as we transition and get our panelists on, we wanted to take a moment just to highlight, again, we referenced some of the student stories that are being released today, and want to just pull out just a couple of highlights from some of the students that we talked to from some of those conversations that we think are helpful for us to help continue to make meaning some of the data that we just saw. And there was 3 things that we want to highlight today. I think a couple pieces that came out that you'll get an opportunity to take a look at when you look at the student stories is that one, for a lot of students, while we saw the team shared earlier, nationally, there's for a lot of high school students, there's a expectation of finishing within 4 years. For a lot of the students that we talked to, they were actually hyper aware of the concept of time to degree completion. We're doing a lot of adjusting of their expectations and learning in real time around what was needed. And we heard a lot of stories around kind of the complicated math, right? We saw a lot of expertise around credits and hours and what needed to be dropped or taken that really rose to just gave a little window into the complexity that students are really navigating to really think about how they can finish on the timeline they're intending. Another piece that came out, and we were speaking with the student Nicole, was talking just a lot about the impact that it had on her mental health. Really locking in, finding that a student feeling potentially out of sync with their intended timeline was really creating a lot of added stress and pressure, some of that also financial, to really make sure that they were trying to finish as quickly as possible, and sometimes to the detriment of their own mental health. And third, a really common theme that came up for a lot of the students that we talked to is that there are often financial consequences for these added semesters, and oftentimes there was the reasons for the added time came down to something like a class or critical credit being offered only once a year, and realizing that we needed to invest in another semester to stay enrolled or navigate kind of complicated financial aid policies to make sure that they could continue to fund their education, and also continue to make progress. Again, these are just a very, very small sampling of some of the topics that came up, students shared, but we think it is a really important window, and we hope you all get an opportunity to dig into some of these stories as you continue to interrogate some of the data. But with that, the next best thing that we have to the student stories is these amazing people's perspectives. So to help us continue to make meaning, I'm going to spend a little time to introduce some of our amazing panelists, and then we will dive into our conversation. So first up, we have Marshai Bradley, who is a proud CPS alumna from Harlan Community Academy High School and who's currently enrolled at the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff. She currently majors in industrial technology, manufacturing, and applied engineering, and is on track to graduate with her degree by the end of 2024. This is where, if we were in person, you'd hear a lot of cheers. In her time at University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff, Marshai has been awarded scholarships from both Boeing and Northrop Grumman, and has spent time volunteering with the Office of Recruitment to help welcome freshman students to campus. In addition to her busy schedule and with school and work, she also found time to graciously share her story as part of our Student Stories series that was published today. So in addition to having Marshai with us here today, there's also an opportunity to read more about her experience through that work. So we'd like to welcome Marshai. Next up, we have Brian Harris. After experiencing the isolation and navigating elite corners of the education system as a young person of color, Brian Harris has dedicated his life to ensuring that not only individuals, but entire communities of marginalized young people are able to put themselves in positions which they can self-determine. Today, Brian serves as the Director of College Pathways in the Office of School Counseling and Post-Secondary Advising at Chicago Public Schools, where his goal is to develop systems that improve the college-going outcomes for CPS district-wide, regardless of school type or zip code. He brings to his current role a wealth of experience helping young people in CPS build and navigate their futures through his prior service as a college and career specialist and coach through Gear Up, and through his time leading the post-secondary team at Julian High School as the post-secondary program manager. Welcome, Brian. Thank you so much for joining us. And finally, we have Dr. Barrington Price. Dr. Price is the Vice President of Student Engagement, as well as the recently announced CEO of Dominican University's new Chicago campus. As a first-generation college student himself, Dr. Price cares deeply about creating pathways for all students to see college as an option. His education in psychology has significantly informed his approach to working with students and helping them develop their understanding of their academic self. Today, his work centers on preparing institutions of higher education to ready themselves in addressing the social and structural determinants of health that often impede students' progress towards degree completion, and holistically uplifting students through their college experience. Let me be the first to welcome you all and just extend a huge thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us today. Before we jump into our conversation, I have to just kind of acknowledge this thing that happens. As we were putting together this panel, we were doing some preparation, and one of the most Chicago things happened. We realized there's a connection between some of our panelists. So maybe I'm gonna start with Marshai. Would you mind telling us a little bit about how you know Mr. Harris here?
Yeah, Mr. Harris used to work at my school at Harlan.
Of course, right. And what do you remember? What do you remember about Mr. Harris?
I remember Mr. Harris being very passive aggressive about our education. He He would always, even though he was real sweet, he was really the sweetest man in the school, but he really did like hold us to what we were like, hold us to like our standards. Like everybody had to do what they had to do. And he really made it clear to everybody, like you wasn't leaving without a plan. And it was just like, who was we to tell Mr. Harris no? So yeah, it was the best.
One man. Brian, any opportunity for rebuttal?
I'm gonna leave that passive aggressive comment to the side for a second, and I'm gonna just say that it's wonderful to see you, Marshai. um, and I was ecstatic to see that you were going to be participating in this panel, and because it's always great to see former students.
Thank you all for sharing. Thank you all for being there. And truly, this was like just one of those Chicago moments that just came to life. So we had to celebrate that. But great to have you here, Barrington. Great to have you here as well. Let's jump into the conversation. I know this is going to go quick, but Marshai, I really want to start with you and your experience. And would you mind just talking us a little bit about, what were some of the reasons that you decided that you needed more time? And what's been some of the impact for you?
Well, for me, the reason I don't got a lot of time. I'm not 6 years deep, but I am years and like I have deep. But the reason I took more time was because I did like run into a decent amount of obstacles that prevented me from like being able to turn my work in on time sometimes, or just like I had recently lost my scholarship that even made me come to this school. So that was like a real big thing for me. And I had got my first apartment around that same time. So it was just like a big thing, and like just managing everything was just a lot. And my time management was real poor for a while. So I feel like that was very big. But
yeah, and as you've been navigating that, once you realized that you were going to need more time, just in your experience, what was some of the were there any particular supports or people maybe on campus that helped you kind of navigate the process of figuring, kind of adjusting your plan?
Well, since I'm an IT major, it's not really a lot of people that's in IT on our school. It's only a certain amount of people, and we're all really close. Like since we're in that like that major together. So when I'm having any difficulties in school, it's like an office with like both of my main teachers I had since like freshman year for like construction and electronics. I've been with them since freshman year, and anytime like I don't know if Mr. Harris remember this, but when I was in high school, I used to ask people to pick my major for me. Like I didn't know what I wanted to do, honestly. So I would just tell them these things. And I used to ask them those same questions, and they would just give me a bunch of information because they've been in the department for so long. And they just sat me down and talked to me like, because I was upset about not being able to graduate in May, because it's like graduating in 2020, we really didn't get a graduation. So I was really upset, but they would just explain to me like, regardless of how you feel, these is the things that you need. And they were just giving me all these different steps and paths to take, because it's just like I shouldn't be mad about the time. And now I'm not mad about the time because it's still at 24, but they did give me a lot of information to work off of and give me a lot of things. They also gave me a lot of things about myself that I didn't notice that I had to work on, because like my time management was poor and it was seeming like I wasn't getting things done, and they would communicate these things with me and then I would work on them in time, and then we'll just meet back up about it later. So I could just say the people in my department helped me very strongly, like with how my school is going right now.
Love to hear that. Thank you for sharing that. Brian, maybe we'll pass to you. I think part of the presentation, I think there is, a hope that maybe grad rates could be, helpful in helping students navigate all the complexity of finding a school. But what do you see as the role that grad rates kind of currently play? And if it's not grad rates, what are some of the main factors that are driving students' college selection right now?
Well, I think that grad rates are something that our coaches and counselors certainly discuss with students. And so it certainly plays a role in the selection process. But in my experience in working with students, it's often not necessarily the primary decision maker, right? CPS students are predominantly low income, and many will be the first in their families to attend college, right? And so that means, one, finances are going to play a huge role in choosing a college, because there's often not necessarily extensive college funds that students can tap into to just pick and choose where they go, right? You literally cannot go if you don't have enough money, right? And then if you're a first generation college student, often that means you're a little bit less aware of what's out there, right? So as Marshai knows, we've been on tons and tons of college trips, right? And it's likely that you're going to pick an institution that you've been able to visit, that has visited your school, right? And so I think the predominant two factors are going to be a combination of like, where do I feel comfortable because I've had the exposure, and where of those places, which is going to be affordable for me.
And so, and as we think about, recognizing, there is this disconnect. I think for a lot of us that do this work, I don't think maybe it's not as terribly surprising, but I think sometimes that's not always as apparent in the language that we use around four-year colleges and with students and families. And so, like, how do you think we can, or, what opportunities do you think exist to help students and families prepare for the possibility of taking more than 4 years? And any advice on how to navigate that conversation?
Yeah, so I think I want to problematize this notion that it's necessarily a bad thing if folks are taking longer than they quote unquote plan to graduate, right? We know, and I'm speaking also from my perspective as someone who matches the demographics of our students as a Black male graduate of a public school, right? So I definitely did have this notion that I planned on graduating in 4 years, but I'll actually use myself as an example, right? Like, certainly the financial implications of taking more than 4 years can be a potential issue, but if I would have had institutional support to graduate, and I did actually graduate in 4 years, but if I would have had institutional support to take longer, it would absolutely have been beneficial for me to take longer, right? So when I went to college, I was kind of a cliche perspective in that I was a Black male. All I knew about myself was that I like sports, and so I majored in sport management. College, in addition to being a means of economic mobility, is a site of identity exploration, and so I learned all these things about myself, and specifically that I like to help people. But I had institutional aid that expired after 4 years, and so as a result, I graduated in 4 years without the experiences and without the major that actually got me into education. So I actually had to take low wage jobs after I graduated because I did not have time to actually switch to the major that I actually wanted, right? And so again, it is certainly the case that in some situations, it's beneficial for students to graduate in 4 years, and especially with those financial implications. But I don't want to paint this picture that is necessarily a bad thing. And I actually think it's on us as an entire higher ed community to make sure that we're celebrating students and supporting students to graduate, no matter what life throws at them. And I'd be remiss if I didn't add that, my first reaction to the data as director of college pathways is just the fact that, look, our graduation rates are going up for both 4 years and for 6 years, right? Not just the rates. Between 2004 and 2014, that's over 2,000 more kids who have degrees per year.
Absolutely.
Right? That's incredible, right? So I'm less focused on whether it's a bad thing that students are graduating in 6 years, and more focused on how can we make sure that we're supporting students in reaching their goals.
Great. Love that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's actually a great transition to Barrington. We got to get you in here. Thanks for your patience. But, again, you're at a university and this is your work. I know Dominican, and there's been a number of institutions that look at this difference between when students are graduating. So could you just share a little bit from your perspective, what have been some of the barriers that you all have identified as an institution that kind of lead to students potentially taking more time? And then how have you worked to try to address some of that?
Yeah, thanks. And I think just building on the words of Marshai and Brian, I'll start with, I think institutions have to do a better job of partnering with our CPS partners. Um, College should not start and begin at the beginning of the 4 years. There's so many things that we can learn from our CPS partners. So there has to be more and deeper partnership, and that takes effort on the part of higher education institutions, seeing all of the relationships that have been developed. Think we see that on this panel today, right? Learning from those relationships, valuing them, and then understanding how we can design systems to make clean, clear handoffs to ensure that students are getting all the things that they need. Because I think our K through 12 partners, folks like Brian, have walked along students like Marshai and can guide us. So that's step one. The second part of this is a shift in our thinking. So if I could back up a little bit to the pandemic, which we learned a lot. And since then, we've talked a lot about social and structural determinants of health. Brian mentioned colleges being a mechanism for economic mobility, which we are, right? Though the importance of talking about the structural determinants that serve as barriers to our students was put on display during the pandemic, where you saw the overprevalence of COVID in communities of color, and then the lack of access to vaccinations and of the like. Again, that is just a microcosm of the lack of resources that our students, particularly our students of color, have been given. And it's up to institutions to figure out, again, how we're solving for that. So if a student shows up presenting with housing or food insecurity, how might we understand or expect for them to engage deeply in the learning process if we're not addressing their most basic needs? So I think institutions first have to get and understand and be able to quickly respond to housing and food insecurity. The prevalence of mental health has also grown. I was just reading an article, the American Psychological Association named that some 60% of students in the last year could have been diagnosed with something related to a mental health diagnosis. And that we've seen an increase of about 40% of caseloads that result in this. So we have to, again, recognize the challenges that mental health play into students' ability to engage and to move through colleges and universities. Another part of this conversation, Dom, is this concept. You sort of mentioned it in the opening here, but this how students see themselves in relationship to learning. And to take it one step further, there's often a set of intro courses, groupings of courses that really have no rhyme or reason why they're paired together, other than it works for the best interest of the university to deliver it in that way, right? So how might we start to look at the groupings and the pairings of courses that students are coming in and stop projecting, these very neat pathways because institutionally it works for us, right? So I think, but that takes an institution and institutions that are centering students in the learning process. The last thing I'll say is about finance. Okay, and I don't believe that students now have the ability to wait 4 years to graduate and to get to work. That's just not a reality today. And so, again, how might we think about ways in which we can redesign schedules, space and time, and think about career development a little bit differently, where we're credentialing students and getting them out into the workplace so they can make an earnable, livable wage while they're going to college. That helps to resolve. We for the longest time, right, have been hearing about finance being a barrier or students being able to pay down their balance. Well, how could we think about ways in which we could address some of those things? So that's where my mind goes with that, Prime.
Thank you. Thank you. I just, in the time that we have left, would just love to open it up, right? I think we've talked a little bit about kind of current reality. We've talked a little bit about aspirations, and I think I do want to kind of live in that aspiration space. Again, as you mentioned, Barrington, I think something that we do well in Chicago is we're getting better at, is collaboration and learning from each other. And even if we haven't seen it yet, from all of you, what are some of your hopes? What do you want to be true about the supports for CPS students to be able to finish, Brian, to your point, period, first and foremost, their intended college pathway, but also if there are opportunities to speed that up, what are the supports that you hope to be true in the next 5 to 10 years?
I want to say that I don't think that it's always just the like the money aspect of why people drop out of college. Sometimes it is like that motivation that people don't get, or like most times people, since like how I'm a first generation college student, some people who are first generation college students don't have people really supporting the idea of going to college. Like it always seemed like a good thing to do, but it's nobody really like helping you with your work. Like when you really going through it and you can't understand something, there's really like sometimes you just feel like you don't have nobody to talk to. And that's also piggybacking on when you're a first generation college student, you don't know what to do or like where to go or how to like maneuver through things. And then that's just something you got to learn. And by the time you do acknowledge all these things and you do learn this, it's really over. Like that's how I kind of feel. Like I feel like college is over really. This is my last year and I feel like I just got here. So it's just like people take that time doing more things than just learning. They also learning to live their life at the same time. So I think if some of these things will be taught in school, like things to prepare you for life, I feel like you will also be, you also have more of a reason to just focus on your studies than to focus on preparing yourself to leave college and things like that. Awesome.
Thank you. What else? What else do we want to be true?
So first of all, like what Marshai says goes. That's the correct answer. As the student representative on the panel, what I want to be true is whatever students like Marshai need to be true, right? And so, I can speak from the district perspective in that we have an alumni arm within our office that where we're constantly engaging with recent graduates, asking them what they need, providing emergency support. And one of the things that we try to respond to those needs. An example might be like our increased focus on early college attainment, where we've really stepped up the number of students earning credentials so that adjustment to college is a little easier because you're used to the work, you're saving money, so that all that exploratory time that Marshai is talking about becomes less burdensome, right? We think about the seminar classes that are fairly prevalent in CPS. The entire focus is helping students think about what is your post-secondary experience going to be like? What do you want out of your post-secondary experience? There are efforts in place, but I'm absolutely hearing that need from our students for increased preparation on what the higher education experience is going to look like. And I hope that we can continue working in tandem. And I'm glad that Barrington is here because Dominican is an institution that our office works with very closely. I think K2 through 12 has to work in tandem with our higher ed partners to bridge that gap, to fill the needs of our students. We have our kids for 12 years. We know them inside and out. And all of a sudden they're starting over in this new education space, right? We need to be communicating. And so like I know the work that Dominican and Barrington do with our compact, for instance, right? In cultivating retention supports. I want to see an expansion of that type of work so that the college experience, whether that means ensuring more students are graduating in the time frame that they feel comfortable in, whether that means ensuring students are able to conquer mental health obstacles that they face along the way, whether that means helping students continue to navigate the world, right? You're still Black and brown students in the context of society, and being a college student doesn't shield you from being a Black or brown person in this society, right? And so I want to formalize that type of relationship so that we can support our students in tandem.
Barrington, anything else to add before we jump off? Just hopes. Yeah.
I think I would just affirm everything that has been said. I would love to see more Black and brown students going to college. That's what I want to see. And them completing in a 4 or 6 year period of time, feeling confident, feeling like they've built the connections and the networks that Marshai was referencing. So just validating and lifting up what was shared before.
And I think just to end on it too, right, an acknowledgement that, we have seen progress. We are seeing progress in these relationships, this communication, and we are starting to see some of the results of these outcomes too. So with that, I want to say thank you to each of you for sharing your perspective, helping us complicate some of this data and really dig into what it can tell us. I also want to particularly say thank you to Marshai for sharing your perspective throughout this project, and for the fact, y'all, it is finals week, and this young woman also still decided to give us a little bit of her precious time as she's trying to navigate that as well. So huge extra thank you for joining us. But thank you all. For our audience, we are going to be transitioning over. Again, we have our post-event discussion. So if you are interested in that, there is a Zoom link in the chat. Please feel free to transition over, and we will be jumping into that discussion in a moment. But for all of you, thank you again sincerely for the work that everybody on this call is doing on behalf of CPS students. And we are looking forward to continuing some of these conversations and engaging in some of this work in the new year. So thank you all.